Lesson 5. Madison and the War of 1812. About 900,000 white settlers moved west of the Appalachians between 1790 and 1810. Some American Indian groups resented these newcomers, who built farms on their lands and hunted the animals they needed for food. The settlers ignored treaties that the United States had signed with American Indian nations of the region. Get ready to read. Start up. Study the illustration of the British burning Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. Scan the lesson images and captions. Then give one reason why the United States went to war. Guiding questions. Why was there conflict between white settlers and American Indians during the early 1800s? What were the causes of the War of 1812? What were the key events and consequences of the War of 1812? Vocabulary: Confederation, Warhawks, Nationalism. Academic vocabulary: Decisive, Commence. What caused conflict in Ohio? Fighting often broke out between these American Indian groups and the settlers. Isolated acts of violence led to larger acts of revenge. As both sides killed innocent people, warfare spread. In Ohio, Little Turtle of the Miamis and Blue Jacket of the Shawnees organized a resistance movement in 1791. Armed with British muskets and gunpowder, the Miamis and Shawnees drove white settlers from the area. President Washington had sent General Anthony Wayne into Ohio in 1794. Forces from the Delaware, Miami, Iroquois, Wabash, and others gathered at a place called Fallen Timbers. They thought that Wayne would have trouble fighting there because fallen trees covered the land. But Wayne's well-trained army pushed through the tangle of logs and defeated the American Indians. Treaties are made. In 1795, leaders of the Miami and other American Indian nations signed the Treaty of Greenville. They gave up land that would later become part of Ohio. In return, they received $20,000 and the promise of more money if they kept the peace. The Treaty of Greenville was one of more than 300 treaties made between the U.S. government and American Indians during the early Republic. Often, a series of treaties were made between an American Indian nation and the U.S. government. In return for American Indian acceptance of the treaty's terms, the government gave American Indian nations a sum of money and, in some instances, equipment. For example, in the Treaty of Fort Wilkinson, the United States gave the Creek Nation $3,000 at the signing, and $1,000 every year for 10 years, $10,000 in goods and merchandise, and 2 sets of blacksmith's tools and men to work them for the term of 3 years. Tecumseh's Confederation confronts the new republic. Ohio joined the Union in 1803. By then, white settlers were pushing beyond Ohio into the Indiana Territory. Angry Shawnees, Kickapoos, and Ottawas vowed to keep settlers from taking more American Indian land. They included 2 Shawnee leaders, Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, a religious leader also called the Prophet. The Kickapoo, Ottawa, Chippewa, and Piankashaw joined with the Shawnee leaders. The Miami initially remained neutral. The Wyandot, Seneca, and Delaware stayed allied with the United States. So did the Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and some groups of Creek. The U.S. government had treaties with several of these American Indian groups that said both sides would cease fighting. The treaties kept these groups from rallying together against the United States. A new settlement in Indiana Territory. The Prophet and Tecumseh taught that white customs corrupted the American Indian way of life. They said that many American Indians depended too much on white trade goods. These included muskets, cloth, cooking pots, and whiskey. They believed that by returning to their old ways, American Indians could gain the power to resist the white invaders. In 1808, the Prophet built a village for his followers along Tippecanoe Creek, in Indiana Territory. American Indians from lands as far away as present-day Missouri, Iowa, and Minnesota traveled to Prophetstown to hear his message. Tecumseh worked to organize the groups of the Northwest into a confederation, or alliance with a shared military command. He called for unity against settlers. Primary source: the whites have driven us from the great salt water, forced us over the mountains. The only way, to check and stop this evil is for all red men to unite in claiming a common equal right in the land. Tecumseh, quoted in Tecumseh, Vision of Glory, Tucker. Tecumseh impressed white leaders. Governor William Henry Harrison grudgingly admitted, "He is one of those uncommon geniuses, which spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things." A major battle at Tippecanoe. Rivalries among American Indian nations kept Tecumseh from uniting all Indians east of the Mississippi River. Still, white settlers were alarmed at his success. In 1811, Harrison marched 1,000 soldiers against Prophetstown on the Tippecanoe Creek. The Prophet was in charge. Tecumseh was away trying to organize Indians in the South. The Prophet led a surprise night attack on Harrison's troops. Both sides suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Tippecanoe. In the end, Harrison's troops defeated the Prophet's forces and destroyed Prophetstown. Whites celebrated the battle as a major victory. Still, Tecumseh and his followers continued to resist white settlement. Reading check. Identify supporting details. Why did Tecumseh advise many American Indians to stop trading with the settlers? Biography. 5 things to know about Tecumseh Shawnee, leader and orator. 1768 to 1813. He led American Indian resistance to white settlement in the Ohio River Valley. At age 14, he fought with the British against colonists in the American Revolution. By supporting a confederation of American Indian groups, he strengthened their forces to fight the U.S. military. His outstanding speaking skills were admired by American Indians and whites. He spoke out against cruelty on both sides of conflicts between American Indians and the U.S. government. Critical thinking. Of people living today or in the recent past, who could you say has leadership skills similar to those of Tecumseh? Explain your reasoning. What were the causes of the War of 1812? Fighting with American Indians hurt relations between the United States and Britain. The British were supplying guns and ammunition to the American Indians on the frontier. They also encouraged Indians to attack U.S. settlements. Meanwhile, the ban on trade with Britain and France expired. Congress then authorized President Madison to make a tantalizing offer. If either the British or French stopped seizing American ships, the United States would reopen trade with that nation. Napoleon quickly announced that France would respect American neutrality. Britain did not respond to the offer. As promised, the United States resumed trade with France, but continued to ban all shipments to or from Britain. a push for war. While Madison did not want war, other Americans were not as cautious. In New England, anti-war feelings ran strong. However, members of Congress from the South and the West called for war. They were known as war hawks. War hawks were stirred by a strong sense of nationalism, or devotion to one's country. War hawks felt that Britain was treating the United States as if it were still a British colony. They were willing to fight a war to defend American rights. The most outspoken war hawk was Henry Clay of Kentucky. Clay wanted to punish Britain for seizing American ships. He also hoped to conquer Canada. The militia of Kentucky are alone able to place Montreal and Upper Canada at your feet, Clay boasted to Congress. War hawks saw other advantages of war with Britain. If Americans went to war with Britain, war hawks said, the United States could seize Florida from Britain's ally, Spain. They also pointed out that Britain was arming American Indians on the frontier and encouraging them to attack settlers. The war hawks felt that winning a war against Britain would bring lasting safety to settlers on the frontier. War is declared. The United States and Britain drifted closer to war as the security of American ships remained an issue. The British continued to board American ships and impress American seamen. To cut off American trade with France, British warships blockaded some American ports. In May 1811, near New York Harbor, a battle broke out between an American frigate and a British ship. The Americans crippled the British ship and left 32 British sailors dead or wounded. War hawks urged Congress to prepare for war. Other members of Congress disagreed. John Randolph of Virginia warned that people of the United States would not submit to be taxed for this war of conquest and dominion. Representatives of New England were especially concerned. They feared that the British Navy would attack New England seaports. At last, President Madison gave in to war fever. In June 1812, he asked Congress to declare war on Britain. The House and Senate both voted in favor of war. Americans would soon learn, though, that declaring war was easier than winning. Reading check. Identify supporting details. Who were the war hawks?
Okay, so there's two things going on here. If you are listening to the tape, we are getting in a battle with England, and we're getting into battles with the natives. Here's why. The natives are living in Western territories. These are all the names of all the different Indian tribes. Not all of them, but a lot of the more well-knowns. And they're getting pushed off their land. So they're trying to defend their land. America's making all these treaties that they are not even honoring. And they're dividing the natives into their different tribes. So they're making a treaty with the Shawnee, and they're making a treaty with the Erie, and they're making a different trade with the Miamis. And it's hard for these groups to get together because they each think they have their own treaty, and they also think America will honor it, which America is not. So what's going on here? It's got a timeline. West white settlers are moving across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley. That's this area here where the Eries, the Shawnees, the Miamis are, I'm going to say this wrong, Susquehannas, and they're making treaties with them and taking their land. And if you remember, there is a Louisiana Purchase. All this land out here now belongs to the United States because of the Louisiana Purchase. That was last week's stuff. The Illinois, the Missouris, the Kansas, the Osages, and the Natchez Just some of the Indian groups that have just lost their land. And a lot of these people are going to help fight against the United States for the British during the War of 1812.
Early events in the War of 1812. The American declaration of war took the British by surprise. They were locked in a bitter struggle with Napoleon and could not spare troops to fight the United States. As the war commenced, however, the United States faced difficulties of its own. The difficulties of building a military. The United States was not ready for war. Because Jefferson had reduced spending on defense, the Navy had only 17 ships to meet the huge British fleet. The Army was small and ill-equipped, and many of the officers knew little about warfare. The state of the Army, said a member of Congress, is enough to make any man who had the smallest love of country wish to get rid of it. These problems made it difficult to maintain national security. Since there were few regular troops, the government relied on volunteers. Congress voted to give them a bounty of cash and land. The money was equal to about a year's salary for most workers. Attracted by the high pay and the chance to own their own farms, young men eagerly enlisted. They were poorly trained, however, with little experience in battle. Many deserted after a few months. Surprising victories at sea. The British Navy blockaded American ports to stop American trade. Though unable to break the blockade, several American sea captains won stunning victories. One famous battle took place early in the war, in August 1812. As he was sailing near Newfoundland, Isaac Hull, captain of the USS Constitution, spotted the British ship HMS Guerriere. For nearly an hour, the two ships jockeyed for position. At last, the guns of the Constitution roared into action. They tore holes in the sides of the Guerriere and shot off both masts. Stunned, the British captain had no choice but to surrender. American sea captains won other victories at sea. These victories cheered Americans, but did little to win the war. Reading check. Identify supporting details. What problems did the U.S. military face?
Okay, so almost no ships. The text says it, and this chart says it as well. 17 warships. If you're looking at the picture, I wish I could mark this up. If you're looking at the picture, 17 warships against 584 warships. Britain's Navy was the strongest in the world, bar none. Then you look down here, somehow it says they had stunning victories or surprising victories. One, the USS Constitution against the British ship, the Guerriere. The USS Constitution is nicknamed Old Ironsides. That's from the video that you should have watched the other day. It had more than 44 guns, and the video says they could have bigger guns. That means the bigger, heavier guns can shoot bigger cannonballs that can tear things up. And it says here, the Constitution's guns roar into action and they tear holes into the Guerriere, shooting off both masts. The masts are the big, huge sails. So the sails have fallen off this ship. The Guerriere can't turn around because it doesn't have any sails. It can't run away because it doesn't have any sails. It can't attack because it doesn't have any sails. It's stuck in the water. The Guerriere could not do this to the USS Constitution. Much of their cannonballs were bouncing off. That's how it got the nickname Old Ironside. That doesn't cover the problems, but that gives you a little bit of the video that you watched and a little bit of understanding about this USS Constitution.
Interactive map. The War of 1812.
Okay, so these are some major battles. The blue stars are American victories. As you can see here, up in the north, they're fighting in the rivers and the lakes between Canada and the United States. British victories are red stars. You've got major victories 1, 2, 3, 4. The biggest, most major victory is Washington, D.C. The American troops are not able to hold off the British troops, and the British troops go right into Washington, D.C., burn the city down, I think including burning the White House. But the funny thing is, that wasn't really their goal to get rid of Washington, D.C. British wanted to go into New York City. They created what's called a diversion, a distraction, by attacking Washington, D.C. They wanted to go to New York City. As you can see, here's the red line. There's no red dots, no red stars, no red lines in New York City. So they didn't really accomplish what they set out to do. So I guess you could say this is kind of a victory for the Americans. Let's see what other pieces of information it's got here. Why were so many important battles in the War of 1812 fought on or near water? C. The bodies of water were strategically important for transporting goods and peoples, including soldiers. So the lakes, they didn't have train tracks again. The lakes go into the rivers, and the sea goes into the rivers, and that's how people get things around. If the British could control the rivers, the lakes, and the ocean, Americans couldn't get any food or supplies or weapons. And so that's why the battles were fought on water, to control the water, to control people from getting around. Why did the British burn Washington, D.C.? Well, I already answered that. It was a diversion so that the British could get to New York City, which is what they really wanted to conquer and take out. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, next one. How did the war affect Canada?
How did the war affect Canada? One goal of the Warhawks was to conquer Canada. They were convinced that Canadians would welcome the chance to throw off British rule and join the United States. An untested force. General William Hull moved American troops into Canada from Detroit. The Canadians had only a few untrained troops to ward off the invasion. However, they were led by a clever British general, Isaac Brock. Brock paraded his soldiers in red coats to make it appear that experienced British troops were helping the Canadians. He also led Americans to think that a large number of American Indians were fighting alongside the Canadians. Brock's scare tactics worked. Hull retreated from Canada. Other attempts to invade Canada also failed. However, on April 27, 1813, U.S. soldiers crossed Lake Ontario and successfully captured York, present-day Toronto. The Americans seized British guns and supplies, and they set fire to public buildings. American victory on Lake Erie. In 1813, the Americans, armed with the guns and supplies they had seized at York, set out to win control of Lake Erie. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry had no fleet, so he designed and built his own ships. In September 1813, he sailed his tiny fleet against the British. During the Battle of Lake Erie, the British battered Perry's own ship and left it helpless. Perry rowed over to another American ship and continued to fight. Finally, the Americans won the battle. Captain Perry wrote his message of victory on the back of an envelope. "We have met the enemy and they are ours." American Indian losses. After losing control of Lake Erie, the British and their ally Tecumseh retreated from Detroit into Canada. General William Henry Harrison, veteran of Tippecanoe, pursued them. The Americans won a decisive victory at the Battle of the Thames. Tecumseh died in the fighting. Without Tecumseh's leadership, the Indian Confederation soon fell apart. Reading check. Summarize. What became of the Warhawks' plan to conquer Canada? end of the war. While Tecumseh was defeated in Canada, some sections of the Creek continued their fight against U.S. settlers in the South. Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee officer, took command of American troops in the Creek War. In March 1814, with the help of Cherokee, Choctaw, and Friendly Creek, Jackson won a crushing victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The leader of the enemy Creek walked alone in Jackson's camp to surrender. "Your people have destroyed my nation," he said. Washington, D.C. burns. In the spring of 1814, Britain and its allies defeated France. With the war in Europe over, Britain could send more troops and ships to fight the United States. In August 1814, British ships sailed into Chesapeake Bay and landed an invasion force about 30 miles from Washington, D.C. American troops met the British at Bladensburg, Maryland. As President Madison watched, the British quickly scattered the untrained Americans. The British met little further resistance on their march to the capital. In the White House, First Lady Dolly Madison waited for her husband to return. Hastily, she scrawled a note to her sister about the attack. Primary source: "Will you believe it, my sister? We have had a battle or skirmish near Bladensburg, and here I am still within sound of the cannon. Mr. Madison comes not. May God protect us. 2 messengers covered with dust come bid me fly, but here I mean to wait for him." Dolly Madison, Memoirs and Letters of Dolly Madison. Soon after, British troops marched into the capital. Dolly Madison gathered up important papers of the president and a portrait of George Washington. Then she fled south. She was not there to see the British set fire to the White House and other buildings. The British considered this an act of revenge for the burning of York. From Washington, the British marched north toward the city of Baltimore. The key to Baltimore's defense was Fort McHenry on Baltimore Harbor. From the evening of September 13th until dawn on September 14th, during the Battle of Baltimore, British rockets bombarded the harbor. When the early morning fog lifted, the broad stripes and bright stars of the American flag still waved over Fort McHenry. American forces had won the Battle of Baltimore. The British withdrew, and the threat to the nation's capital ended. Francis Scott Key, a young American lawyer who witnessed the battle, wrote a poem about it. Soon his poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, was published and set to music. Today, it is the national anthem of the United States. Jackson becomes a hero in the Battle of New Orleans. In late 1814, the British prepared to attack New Orleans. From there, they hoped to sail up the Mississippi. However, Andrew Jackson was waiting. Jackson had turned his frontier fighters into a strong army. He took Pensacola in Spanish Florida to keep the British from using it as a base. He then marched through Mobile and set up camp in New Orleans. Jackson's force included thousands of frontiersmen and Choctaw. The Choctaw were longtime rivals of the Indian nations who had been allied with the British. Many of Jackson's troops were expert riflemen. Citizens of New Orleans also joined the army to defend their city from the British. Among the volunteers were hundreds of African Americans. The American soldiers dug trenches to defend themselves. On January 8, 1815, the British attacked. Again and again, British soldiers marched toward the American trenches. More than 2,000 British fell under the deadly fire of American sharpshooters, and especially American cannons. Only 7 Americans died. Americans cheered the victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Overnight, Andrew Jackson became a national hero. His fame did not dim even when Americans learned that the battle had taken place 2 weeks after the war had ended. The United States and Britain had already signed a treaty in Europe, but news took 2 months to cross the ocean by sailing ship. African Americans in the war. The Battle of New Orleans was not the only place where black and white soldiers fought together. Throughout the War of 1812, African Americans joined in defending the nation against the British. After the British attacks on Washington and Baltimore, African American volunteers helped defend Philadelphia against a possible attack. Bishop Richard Allen and the Reverend Absalom Jones recruited some 2,000 men to build Philadelphia's fortifications. The state of New York organized 2 regiments of black volunteers to serve in the Army. African Americans also served with distinction in the U.S. Navy. They helped win the Battle of Lake Erie, as well as other naval battles. Commander Nathaniel Shaler praised one particular black sailor who was wounded in battle. Primary source: "He fell near me, and several times requested to be thrown overboard, saying he was only in the way of others. When America has such sailors, she has little to fear from the tyrants of the ocean." Nathaniel Shaler, letter to his agent, January 1st, 1813. Reading check. Identify main ideas. What achievement made Andrew Jackson well known throughout the country? What were the consequences of the War of 1812? By late 1814, Americans knew that peace talks had commenced, but they did not know if they would succeed or how long they would last. As Jackson was preparing to fight the British at New Orleans, New Englanders were meeting to protest Mr. Madison's war. New Englanders protest the war. The British blockade had hurt New England's sea trade. Also, many New Englanders feared that the United States might win land in Florida and Canada. If new states were carved out of these lands, the South and the West would become more influential than New England. Delegates from around New England met in Hartford, Connecticut in December 1814. Most were Federalists. They disliked the Democratic-Republican president and the war. Some delegates to the Hartford Convention threatened to nullify or cancel the state of war in their states if the war continued. Others threatened to leave the Union. Then, while the delegates debated what to do, news of the peace treaty arrived. The Hartford Convention ended quickly. With the war over, the protest was meaningless. In the end, the threat of secession further weakened the dying Federalist Party. The indecisive results of the war. A peace treaty was signed in the city of Ghent, in present-day Belgium, on December 24, 1814. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams and one of the American delegates, summed up the Treaty of Ghent in one sentence: "Nothing was adjusted, nothing was settled." Britain and the United States agreed to restore pre-war conditions. The treaty said nothing about impressment or neutrality. These issues had faded due to the end of the wars in Europe. Other issues were settled later. In 1818, for example, the 2 nations settled a dispute over the border between Canada and the United States. Looking back, some Americans felt that the War of 1812 had been a mistake. Others argued that Europe would now treat the young republic with more respect. The victories of heroes like Oliver Hazard Perry, William Henry Harrison, and Andrew Jackson gave Americans new pride in their country. As one Democratic-Republican leader remarked, "The people are now more American. They feel and act more as a nation." Reading check. Identify supporting details. What was the purpose of the Hartford Convention?